I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's awarding of the Edward M. Chase Peace Prize. This is a remarkable event and one that is quite close to my heart. It's close to my heart in part because the first thing that happened to me after I started working at Dartmouth in 2013 was that the then deputy director, who had been running the place before I arrived, gave me a flash drive with about 55 essays that were being considered for the Chase Prize, and I immediately wondered what I'd gotten myself into. But more importantly, I've always loved this prize because of the story behind it. Edward Chase, I don't think that was his original name, was an immigrant from Lithuania who came to the United States in 1888, as my ancestors did too. He lived in Manchester, New Hampshire. He was not a Dartmouth graduate, but he was very friendly with a distinguished graduate from the college. And he had made a healthy fortune, first in department stores and then in furniture. And he made a bequest to the college when he was, well, the bequest was obviously paid posthumously, but in his will. And it was for a student who would write that student of the college who shall submit the best essay on a subject relating to the promotion of world peace. And the date of his death is quite noteworthy because it was November 16th, 1939. For those of you who remember your poetry, that was the time that, as Auden put it, in the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark. It was probably one of the dimmest moments in Western history. In recent centuries, the Nazis had overrun Poland just 2.5 months earlier, and it didn't seem like there was going to be anything to stop them from conquering all of Europe. So it was a particularly grim time, and I thought that Edward Chase showed remarkable hope and prescience to endow a Peace Prize at that moment. I want to just say that this is also a particular prize that is close to my heart because it regards the issue of Croatia and its new nationalism. In 1991, I was a reporter for Time magazine driving around Croatia as the war unfolded there, and remember vividly being in Split and Zagreb, and finally a place called the Krajina, which was a Serb enclave there, which was sort of the spark that everyone was sure would blow up the whole region. So I'm delighted that Blaze's work has been so distinguished, and it's on such an important subject. I should add, by the way, that the Chase Peace Prize is one of those high points of our calendar. Mr. Chase's granddaughters still stay in touch with us to inquire about the prize winners every year. One of them is emerita professor of political science at Wellesley. His other granddaughter lives on the West Coast, and it's one of the nice things we get to do, that we pass on the invitation, the information to them. Well, before passing it on to Blaze, I just want to again congratulate him. I really want to thank our out-of-town guests for coming for this event. It's a great honor to scholarship that they would come all this way, and it was nice of us to arrange appropriate Dartmouth weather for them. And with that, I will turn it over to you, and congratulations. And don't everyone feel like they have to sit in the front row.
So actually, he's turning it over to me.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm Margaret Darrow. I'm a professor in the history department, and I want to thank the John Sloan Dickey Center, first of all, for organizing this seminar in honor of last year's Chase Peace Prize winner, who is, sitting to my left, Blaze Joel. Blaise graduated from Dartmouth last spring with high honors in history. His history honors thesis, I have here, One People, One Nation, Two Wars, Nationalism and Memory in Croatia and the Breakup of Yugoslavia. This won the History Department's class of 1859 prize for the best thesis in European history, as well as the Chase Peace Prize as the best senior thesis about war, conflict resolution, and or the prospects and or problems of maintaining peace. Blaise is now a graduate student in a dual master's program in international and world history, jointly offered by Columbia University and the London School of Economics. Blaise is named after the patron saint of Dubrovnik, and that gives you a clue as to his background. He's of Croatian background, and as a Dartmouth undergraduate, he sought to understand what had happened in Croatia, in the Balkans, in the 1990s. And after taking a number of courses that focused on nationalism and war and peace, he began to work on a honors thesis proposal. But he came up against the fact that the history department had then, and did not have then, and still does not have now, a historian of Eastern Europe. I agreed to advise his thesis, first of all because he came to me so well recommended by my colleagues, but also because of his own enormous preparation for his project and his passion for the subject. So I was willing to take this on, even though I'm far from being an expert in Balkan history. I'm actually a modern French historian. So far more than is usually the case for undergraduate research or even graduate research, this project is wholly Blaise's. I mean, his thesis is really entirely his own work, with very little kind of professorial input or direction. So I think it makes it even greater honor that he has won these, that his work won these prizes. And it is this thesis that is at the center of our seminar this afternoon. Two scholars are with us to discuss with him and with us the issues, some of the issues and questions that his thesis raises. And they are experts in these fields. So I'm going to introduce them now, both of them now, and then Blaise will speak, and then they will comment, and then we'll have a discussion. It will work in this order. So to Blaise's left is Professor Tanya Domi. She teaches in Columbia's School of International Public Affairs and is an affiliate of the Harriman Institute devoted to Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European studies. And she's a fellow of the Emerging Democracies Institute in Washington, D.C. She was involved in developing policy with regard to the Dayton Peace Accords in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And her research and teaching focuses on democratic development, human rights, gender, and sexual identity in the Balkans. She's a frequent commentator in the press, the radio and TV news about Balkan issues, and she's currently researching and writing about the emerging LGBT movement, human rights movement in the Balkans. To her left is Professor Ariella Lang, who is the Associate Director of Columbia's Institute for the Study of Human Rights. She also oversees the Alliance for Historical Dialogue and Accountability and teaches in the History Department. Her teaching and research interests include genocide, minority rights, memory studies, and the relationship between religion and nationalism. She has published books and articles about the Holocaust and nationalism, focusing particularly on Jews in Italy, and is working on an edited volume, The Politics of Memory, Victimization, Violence, and Contested Narratives of the Past. It's particularly germane to our discussion today, to Joel's thesis, to Blaise's thesis. And so now I turn the discussion over to you, Blaise.
Before I start, I want to thank Professor Darrow not only for those kind words and for her rather modest take on how well she advised me in my undergrad thesis, but also for helping to organize this talk while she was in Paris last term. I also want to thank Professors Domi and Lang not only for coming to speak up in Hanover today, but also for their work in advising my master's dissertation. I want to thank the Dickey Center for the opportunity. I'd like to thank the students who are here, both those I do know and those I don't, for taking the time out of your busy schedule and trudging back here in the snow to come. And I'd like to thank my family, who not only made the trip up from Pennsylvania for this, but also helped support me during my research, and especially Professor Sacerdote for the technological save. My portion of the talk is going to be titled Nationalism Set in Stone, and it will discuss war memorials in Croatia. So before I begin, I'd like to start, rather than giving a detailed or overly descriptive discussion of the breakup of Yugoslavia, I'm just going to sort of conceptualize it in a few main theoretical points. The first being that this war was not the result of ancient ethnic hatreds, as many in the press tried to portray it at the time. Rather, it was the result of opportunistic and nationalistic politicians who manipulated perceived ethno-national differences in order to further their own personal and nationalistic programs. In the Homeland War, as it's known in Croatia, and the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina were very traumatic events that inspired certain memorial responses and also have facilitated certain essentialized narratives of the war. For example, Bosniaks are generally seen as victims in the war, Serbs are generally seen as aggressors, and Croats lie somewhere in the middle. However, and very importantly for the memorial culture of Croatia, Croatia itself sees, domestically, Croatia sees itself as both a victim and a victor in the conflict, and this is profoundly manifested in its memorial culture, as I will show. But first, since some people in this room were not alive when Yugoslavia was still around, myself included, Yugoslavia was a communist, non-aligned nation made up of 6 republics and 2 autonomous regions. It consisted of 6 principal ethnic groups, which are listed on the screen, and as you can see from the map, more or less line up with the republican boundaries, the key exceptions being Bosnia and to a lesser extent Croatia. And in order to figure out this so-called national question of ethnic minorities, Tito's government constructed a Yugoslav identity, which worked in concert with its slogan of brotherhood and unity, and sought to mitigate the role of the World War II history in the region and supersede ethno-national identity. However, as the history of the late 80s and early 90s in the region show, that effort, while it had some successes on the ground, was ultimately not successful on a pan-national scale. The devastation in the wars was incredibly immense, as you can see from that photo of Vukovar in 1991. And in both wars, both the war in Croatia and the war in Bosnia, ethnic Croats played a duplicitous role as both defender and aggressor, leaving their history more ambiguous than the essentialized narratives would indicate. Now, all the 3 principal ethnic groups in the war, the Bosniaks, the Serbs, and the Croats, were both perpetrators and victims of crimes against humanity and war crimes, but Croat actions were perhaps the most balanced between the two. Looking just within the borders of Croatia, you have Vukovar and the Ovčara massacre, and then Operation Storm at the end of the war. And I'd be happy to talk more about the war itself or the war in Bosnia as part of the question and answer session, but my talk today is just going to focus on this victim and victor narrative and how it is enshrined in the memorial culture within Croatia itself. So memorials provide a politicized rhetoric to commemoration within Croatia, helping to ensure that this national narrative of victor and victim is remembered. In my research, I found that most war memorials in Croatia displayed certain common themes that emphasized a distinct Croatness, which was most often conveyed through the use of religious, specifically Catholic, and national symbolism. It was accompanied by what I termed in my undergrad dissertation the cult of ne zaboraviti, which means never forget. And this is most often manifested in, as you can see in these two monuments and memorials, a list of names of those who have fallen in the war, both civilians and soldiers, as martyrs for the birth of the nation. And I argue in my thesis that the memorial culture of Croatia has worked to hinder the efforts of the ICTY and EU, as well as domestic peace-building efforts at reconciliation in a war-torn region. The first location I'm going to speak about is Dubrovnik. So Dubrovnik was placed under siege and shelled from the mountains both above the city and the water around it from October 1991 to May 1992. And it is commonly said that this was the first time in the history of the old town of Dubrovnik that it was directly targeted in any war effort. Now, as many of you may know today, Dubrovnik is a very big tourist destination, and when you're in the old town, you cannot really tell that it was impacted by the war, either from extent of devastation or various memorials. However, as you can see in this photo, there's a difference in the tiles. There's an older-looking tile and newer-looking tile, and in a way, that serves as a memorial to highlight the extent of the devastation that occurred, but also show just how quickly and just how strongly Dubrovnik and Croatia as a whole could rebound and rebuild. So although not an explicit monument, this serves as a more subtle memorial to those who knew the war in Dubrovnik and knew the large extent of the damage there. Two memorials do exist in Dubrovnik, and they are the Mount Surge Stations of the Cross and the Memorial Room of the Dubrovnik Defenders. Mount Surge played a key role in the defense of Dubrovnik as the primary location of resistance. The mountain, which sits just on the old town, is in this photo to the left, which sits just above the city, was under siege as well, leaving only a tiny switchback trail up the side of the mountain between the walled city and Fort Imperial, which now hosts a museum on the war, for supplies to be delivered. The path today is marked by stations of the cross, both in the form of wooden crosses and large metal depictions of the Passion. Marking a location imbued with a history of persevering through suffering with Christian imagery reinforces the victim and victor narrative of Croatia by adding these religious overtones. Just as Christ had suffered, Croatians and the residents of Dubrovnik had as well, and just as Christ had won eternal victory through his suffering, the city of Dubrovnik would as well. The Memorial Room of Dubrovnik Defenders is located at the end of the Straten, which is the main street that goes through the town. And it's a very small memorial. It's only one room in the side of another tourist attraction. And it was dedicated, quote, with eternal respect and gratitude to the Croatian defenders of the Dubrovnik region who died under various circumstances in the defense and liberation of southern Croatia during the Homeland War. To those most deserving who ensured that the city of Dubrovnik would remain eternally the city of freedom. As I said, the memorial is just one room, but it memorializes victims through their names and their photographs, as well as photos from the city under siege and various memorabilia, such as flame-torn flags and some of the discarded old tiles are in the room. Vukovar has become a memorial city. Vukovar in eastern Slavonia has become a memorial city with some buildings in the center of town completely rebuilt, some left as hollow shells, and some still visibly scarred by the war. This was extremely intentionally done because the city marks the apex of Croatian suffering during the Homeland War. And this was all done to reinforce the victimhood narrative of Croatians. There is no mention of the Serbs who stayed, only reminders of the Serbs who came in to conquer Vukovar. The memorial cross is a symbol of defiance because of its location right on the river, right on the Danube River across the banks from Serbia. As you can see, it's a Latin Catholic cross and features the Croatian checkerboard coat of arms, as well as a dedication, quote, to the victims for a free Croatia. And if you go there today, or if you go there now, because after 2013, when Croatia joined the EU, in addition to the Vukovar town flag and the Croatian flag, there's now an EU flag that flies right along next to it as sort of another dig at Serbia that Croatia is now in the EU and Serbia has yet to get there. The water tower at Vukovar is the symbol of the town and therefore of Croatia's war efforts. Though it was badly shelled and damaged, as you can see, it remained standing throughout the 90-day siege, including having a Croatian flag flown from the top until the fall of the city. Today, the memorial placard at the water tower reads, quote, "The damaged water tower was a symbol of devastation, but also a symbol of resistance, defiance, and invincibility. The significance of the water tower goes beyond the local region. It will stand permanently to remind people of the tragedy that happened to the citizens of Vukovar and the defenders from all over Croatia. As such, it will be a reminder that such evil never happens again." Now, Vukovar is seen as the apex of Croatian suffering because of the Ovčara massacre. And the Ovčara massacre was an event in which 261 patients, doctors, and volunteers were taken from the town hospital to Ovčara farm, which is a couple kilometers outside of Vukovar, where they were beaten and killed the day before the Red Cross was due to come in to evacuate the wounded and the doctors in the hospital. And this has been in the news recently with the acquittal of Šešelj at the ICTY. The Memorial Hospital preserves the conditions from what the patients endured while they were there in terms of both the cramped conditions and the function of the rooms. The hospital today is still a working hospital. However, the basement, which was the only part of the hospital that was left intact after the war, is, as you can see, redone to imitate bunk rooms, maternity wards, etc. The main hall of the Memorial Hospital is covered with mirrors, and in the center contains an eternal flame. The room is otherwise dark, other than that red light emanating from the base, and while in there, a voice recording reads off the names of the 261 who disappeared repeatedly. The Ovčara Spomen Dome, or Memorial House, is perhaps the most symbolic place of memory in Croatia, repurposing the warehouse in which the Croats were beaten before their ultimate death. The doors are permanently affixed open so that they may never be shut again, in both the literal and the figurative sense, so that the doors can never be closed on anyone again, and so that history never forgets the events that occurred there. But the interior is left dark to mirror the conditions that the 261 Croats found themselves. The floors are concrete with bullet casings embedded, and around the side there's a thin strip of hay that features a number of personal effects that were found on the victims both in the warehouse and in the gravesite by the UN. Around the walls there are photographs of the victims of the massacre, and there are 261 stars in the ceiling to represent them. In the center, under the stars, as you can see in the bottom picture, there's an eternal flame accompanied by a spiraling list of the names. And this is to symbolize that although their lives have been extinguished, their life will forever provide a light to the Croatian people. The mass grave is just a couple hundred yards down the road, features a black monolith in the center with a dove of peace in it. It's a little hard to tell from that photo, but the dove of peace gives way to 4 cracks, which form the shape of a cross. And this symbolizes the peaceful community fractured by both the war and the events of Ovčara. And as from the title slide, if you remember, there are bushes on the side, and there are 200 bushes to represent the 200 people that have been unearthed from this grave. Now, Knin in the Krajina was the site of Croatian victory during the Homeland War because it was the capital of the Serb entity. Therefore, the memorial culture that exists is completely different from the one that exists in either Dubrovnik or Vukovar. The primary monument within Knin is called the Monument to Croatian Victory. It is located in the main square in the center of town. The memorial was revealed for the 2011 Victory Day celebrations and cost over €1 million to build. And it was dedicated, quote, "in honor and gratitude to the brave Croatian defenders who gave themselves for freedom." The main square is, you can see in the photo, is dotted with facts about the war, such as the events at Ovčara, poems and quotes, and ringed by a boundary that lists all of the battalions from across Croatia who came to fight in Operation Storm. Within the monument itself, the left-hand side, as you're looking at it in this photo, features a Latin cross, and the right-hand side features a video stream. And the video stream not only shows the events of the first year of the war, which show the Serbs taking over the Krajina, but also Operation Storm, which shows the Croats taking it back. This monument takes the methods of remembering Croatian tragedy and co-opts them to celebrate victory. Never forget Croatian victimhood turns into remember the glory of Croatian victory. The video reel serves to not only further this new dynamic, but also to provide a justification of sorts for Operation Storm by highlighting the destruction wrought by Serb troops in the first year of the war. The Gospic and Polin-Dvor massacres were anathema to the Croatian narrative of victim and victor because they were sites of massacres carried out by Croats against Serbs during the Homeland War. Over 100 Serbs were killed at Gospic, and 18 were murdered in Polin-Dvor. Dealing with these crimes has been very difficult from a legal standpoint, as the protests and assassinations surrounding the Mirko Norac trial for Gospic reveal. But the memorial culture of both places completely ignores the history of the events that occurred in these towns during the Homeland War, evoking what British social anthropologist Paul Connerton has called repressive erasure. Gospic is by far the larger community and consequently has a more established memorial culture. However, the monuments make no mention to the atrocities committed there by Croats, either in World War II or during the Homeland War. In one of the main squares of town sits a trio of monuments, including one to the first Croatian president, Franjo Tuđman. The central monument, pictured here, is a large monolith with a checkerboard pattern cut away that reveals a Latin cross in the middle. The monument evokes symbols of Croatian identity, as do other monuments that commemorate fallen soldiers. However, it is the dedication of the memorial that is the clearest example of repressive erasure. The monument is dedicated, quote, to the veterans and civilian victims of the Homeland War who gave their lives in the defense of Gospic. There's no mention of any of the Serbs who lived in the city, fought for the city, only reminders, again, of the Serbs who came to conquer. Polin-Dvor is a very, very small village located in eastern Slavonia. The entirety of the town is one street and a couple houses, and despite its seeming insignificance, the town was hit very hard during the war and still bears the scars of battle, as you can see in the photo. At one end of town is a monument to the soldiers from the town who fought during World War II. It was symbolically beheaded by a shell during the war and has not been rebuilt, and sits in front of a building that is the shell of itself that was also damaged during the war in the 90s. This building and this monument set the tone of repressive erasure through the town because of the maintenance of the status quo. Many buildings in the town are still in ruin, while only some have been partially rebuilt, symbolizing the lack of success in moving past the war in this community. In fact, on the other end of town, there are two very small monuments about the Homeland War, and those are dedicated to battalions from Zagreb who marched through the city on their way to fight in eastern Slavonia. So there's no mention of the Homeland War in Polin-Dvor in the town itself. Now, while the conflicts may be over, their memory still influences life and politics in the former Yugoslavia, and Croatia is no exception, despite its current EU status. This is in large part due to the memorial culture of Croatia, in terms of holidays, museums, and memorials that reinforce the narrative of victim and victor, in accordance with the mantra of never forget. These memorials and this rhetoric has prevented the war from ever fading into history and creates tangible places and events at which to remember the specific essentialized narrative of it that the government proffers, this victim and victor narrative, which has limited the success of democratization in the ICTY. And I'm going to close with a quote from the new Croatian president's inaugural address from a year ago, in which she says, quote, "In this special moment, let us remember all those Croatian sons and daughters, known and unknown, who, in the 1,000 years of fighting for Croatian independence, built their lives in the foundations of the modern Croatian state. Let me express special gratitude to the Croatian veterans who have been and will continue to be the keystone of our country. We owe deep gratitude to the first Croatian president, Dr. Franjo Tuđman, the frontrunner of this historic endeavor and the founding father of the modern Croatian state. The same way President Tuđman reconciled the divided nation and created conditions for the establishment of the Croatian state, today we must turn a new page for a better future through new Croatian unity. I want to be able to tell my grandchildren one day about the time when we stood side by side, just like we did in the Homeland War, how we fought for a better life in Croatia and how we won that fight. Because we are a winning nation, an enduring nation, and a hard-working nation, there is nothing we cannot do if we stand united." Thank you.
Good job. Well, I want to thank Blaise for inviting me. This is indeed a pleasure. I've taken a great sense of joy. I've experienced a great sense of joy in working with him. In this field of the Balkans, we sort of have an addiction, and I'll never, get over it. it's with me for life. And so when I meet a student who wants to plow the ground, I go right there with them. And so this is really wonderful. I also want to thank Margaret so much for the invitation, and to Dartmouth for hosting us here today at the Dickey Center. So first of all, let me just say that that Blaze's superlative thesis on Croatia's crowning achievement to achieve nation statehood via a brutal and bloody war significantly contributed to the breakup of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia includes a section on war crimes and the influence of the International War Crimes Tribunal of former Yugoslavia on Croatia's EU accession process. So I will reserve my comments exclusively to the section on war crimes and about how that cooperation with ICTY, which is the acronym for the International War Crimes Tribunal of former Yugoslavia, and how that actually yielded to and assisted Croatia in entering the EU. I would also add that, just as Blaise has said, even though they are a member of the EU, they continue to face considerable challenges on a number of fronts, including national minorities, human rights, transparency, corruption. These are issues that are a theme throughout the Western Balkans, and in some respects throughout some of the earlier EU accession countries in East Central Europe. I would, in reviewing, it's like over 200 pages, very impressive, because not by the length itself, but by the analysis. Blaise effectively builds the framework in the run-up to the Croatian homeland and Bosnian wars. And I quote a theorist, and that is Jonathan Glover, posits that the breakup of Yugoslavia was characterized by classical elements of tribalism, drawing on the difference in groups. Glover's summary of the events that led to the war is fairly accurate. Hostility is inflamed by nationalistic rhetoric of politicians, in the case of Milosevic in Serbia. Other groups then feel threatened and react with their own defensive nationalism, as in the case of Tudjman in Croatia, and then people are pushed into a trap by politicians. Then, in psychologically deeper ways, the rival groups become mutually trapped by their responses to one another. That is how Yugoslavia fell apart. And I think he's fair, but I would also urge you to consider, and this is just furthering your research, is to consider Guyon's book on myth of ethnic war. Because Guyon believes that the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s were reactionary moves designed to thwart populations that were threatening the existing structures of political and economic power. In other words, Guyon asserts that the myth of ethnic war was a political construct taken upon the opportunistic leadership, a horrible constellation of reactionary politicians, and pitted people against one another, as Glover suggests, but actively pitted citizens against one another, and that was the only way they could achieve resisting global forces for political and economic change. And so I think going one step further, that all of us who are students of the Balkans really need to take him on and understand him. The centrifugal forces of Croatia's nationalism and their 1,000-year dream of independence was without question the impetus of a majority of war crimes that were committed during the 1990 war on Serbian ethnic Croatians and the war with Serbia, as well as in armed intervention in Bosnia. And once land and momentum was achieved, Franjo Tuđman entered the Washington Agreement in March 1994 with the help of the United States to finally achieve his nation state that was realized after launching Operation Storm and the retaking of Knin in 1995 that once and for all settled the question of the state of Croatia. The Croatian War resulted in the deaths of more than 7,000 people, more than 13,000 went missing, more than 200 houses were destroyed. Croatia paid a very heavy price indeed. In historical context, the reappearance of Croatian yearnings for independence was manifest in the late 1960s through the early 1970s via the Croatian Spring Movement, which Blaise really does a very fine job of describing. Tito acted to quell an uprising and arrested Tuđman in 1972 after he had shifted his politics from a hardline socialist and member of the party to a nationalist. There is a saying in Bosnia that Tito always arrested the right people. And this is true because he also arrested Alija Izetbegović, who did become subsequently president of an independent Bosnia, as in March 1992. Blaise has also talked about the concentration camps and the never again, and I actually have a theory about never again in the case of Tito's Yugoslavia. The repeat occurrence of concentration camps during the 1991 to 95 wars is beyond tragic, and as I have previously posited in my writings and in my talks, Tito constructed the Yugoslav Compact in coining the theme of brotherhood and unity, which was essentially built upon a house of trauma and grievances, legacies of battles between and among the World War II era Croatian Ustaša government, which collaborated with the Third Reich, and the civil war between the partisans and the Chetniks. The highway of brotherhood and unity literally built from Zagreb to Belgrade, in my view, became a highway of amnesia, with terrible consequences borne out in the homeland and Bosnian wars. And I would also suggest, and this might be interesting in terms of memory, that what occurred and what we have found out in interviewing survivors is that there is an intergenerational narrative that has been passed on that was never processed out of World War II. And this has been passed down generation from grandfathers to grandsons, from grandmothers to granddaughters, that people live with and walk through. And I would suggest that, for example, in Foča, Bosnia, where some of the worst crimes took place in Bosnia, there were grandfathers that were forced to jump from that bridge to their death. There were uncles that fled the bridge and survived in the woods. And those narratives were brought fully into the 1990 wars because Tito, as a compact, made sure he kept his finger on nationalism and kept the lid on nationalism. So there was no process about what happened during World War II. So it is not surprising to me in that historical context that the litany and numbers of concentration camps is unabridged within Blaise's text. Almost all the camps, even the most notorious, were often ordinary buildings. So the effort to memorialize them is fraught with all kinds of challenges. The least of them may be the fact that some of them are privately owned, or they're owned in London, as in the case of Ormosca. But even so, they were all centers for some of the most degrading forms since World War II of torture, rape, daily beatings, mock executions, deprivation, prisoners who had very little to eat, existing in the most unsuitable facilities. Among them, the most notorious would include Ormosca and Prijedor, Bosnia, Trnopolje, a school run by Bosnian Serbs where hundreds of Bosniaks were tortured, raped, and humiliated, Vela Promet, and Heliodrome. The numbers overwhelm. They actually are staggering in my view. According to the Croatian Association of Camp Inmates of Serbian concentration camps, Serbs established 480 camps. As Blaise has turned to and suggested, nearly 330 of them were in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 80 were in Croatia. The UN confirmed at least 300. So the toll on human beings that was wrought from these wars cannot be underestimated. And I think it's pretty remarkable that we would suggest to these people, go home. Go home next door to the man who raped your wife in front of you and killed your daughter. Go home and make peace. Go home and make reconciliation. Germany took over 50 years, and they were led by a wise man by the name of Konrad Adenauer when they had that opening and they could begin to denazify and face their past with incredible courage. Fast forward, Angela Merkel has probably cashed in her political capital doing what is probably one of the most humane acts of admitting more than 1 million refugees, and probably now will lose re-election. But she understood the Nazi lesson. And this is the regrettable situation I think we now see taking place because it's so early in Croatia's history. It's so early in all the countries where you have international jurisprudence, you have international courts acting, you have national courts acting, you have millions of victims, and you do not have the capacity, nor would you ever have the capacity to address all crimes. So what do the international community do? Blaise makes some comments here. He uses a framework on the court itself, and I agree with some of it, and I disagree with other aspects of it, but not in a credibility way, just in a philosophical way. The first international tribunal established since the end of World War II in Nuremberg was the International War Crimes Tribunal of former Yugoslavia, and it was established during a war. That had never happened before in the history of the world. Irrespective of deterrence, which Blaise says, it wasn't a deterring factor, and maybe it wasn't. However, the fact that it was established and that international jurisdiction was put into place and put into effect to take countenance of all the crimes that were happening, to begin to build the capacity of the court in the early days and put together indictments, which was very painstaking, a very difficult and arduous effort. And actually, to say from the perspective of the international community that we are going to try you. We are going to prosecute crimes. You may not believe us, but we're going to do it. And a lot of people had their doubts. They had a very rough start. And here's some credit to the United States. It funded the court perhaps more than any other country. It really provided a lot of prosecutors and invested a lot of resources. It was a very strong supporter of the court. And again, this is to shift from victor's justice out of Nuremberg to a 20th century model of international jurisprudence. In its precedent-setting decisions on genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, the tribunal has shown that an individual's senior position can no longer protect them from prosecution. ICTY rulings establish, and this is groundbreaking, establish rape as torture, rape as a crime against humanity, and mass rape could yield to a conviction of genocide. Enslavement of women in rape camps constituted a crime against humanity in the case of Kunerats, and rape constituted violations of the laws and customs of war. Now, why do I bring that up? Because the Tokyo Tribunal never prosecuted anyone for rape. It has always been a crime. Neither did Nuremberg. And the reason they sort of turned away from it is because the Russians invaded Berlin from the east, and they engaged in mass rape of German women when they got to Berlin. This is groundbreaking, and the credit goes to the brave women of Bosnia, who actually, a judge and a lawyer who were enslaved in the Ormaska rape camp in Prijedor, were in refugee status in Croatia. They took 200 testimonies. They went to The Hague. They submitted them, and the court agreed for the first time in the history of international jurisdiction and jurisprudence to prosecute the crimes of rape. Now, it is estimated many Croatian women were raped, it's estimated 20 to 50,000 Bosnian women were raped. There is no way that they will ever be all prosecuted. But the symbolism and the international jurisprudence is really exceptional. The tribunal has laid the foundations for what is now the accepted norm for conflict resolution and post-conflict development across the globe, specifically that leaders suspected of mass crimes will face justice. We only need to turn our eyes towards the International Criminal Court, which was also set up during the establishment of both the Tribunal on former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Now there is recognition of the need for a permanent court. The only thing that is regrettable in this case is that the United States has been, thus far to date, has failed to support it. The reason why is that our Pentagon opposed it during the Rome negotiations because they don't want to face potential prosecutions for crimes against humanity. The United States always likes to have it both ways. We see that we want to be the arbiter, we want to tell people, and we want to tell states, look, you have violated the following international human rights, but we have many times in our history refused to yield to that same standard. And as a human rights professor, I freely criticize my government. While Croatia cooperated with respect to moving forward, and I'm not going to review your work, which is considerable, on the myth of heroes and the myth of victors and of victims, because as you said, in Croatia there are both, without a doubt. When Croatia cooperated by turning over to The Hague Generals Gotovina, Markic, and also Ivan Chermak, this was a significant move towards the West and towards Brussels, and this was required. This case was significant in that Gotovina, who led the operation, actually was considered like the great father, the general, the protector, and this to be put on trial for, I'm sorry, to be put on trial for these crimes, this would be a pushback on Croatia's narrative. And what happened was they were acquitted. And I think that's a failure, a significant failure by the International Criminal Court, the International Tribunal. And a couple of other failures include the failure to prosecute Franjo Tuđman before his death, which was a significant, unfortunate development. They just didn't have the capacity. The same thing would have happened with Izetbegović and Milosevic, who died while on trial. There are other cases that are outstanding. The most recent is the case of Mr. Goran Hadžić, who is now his trial's been suspended. He committed a lot of crimes in Slavonia, has been charged with major crimes there. This case is delayed once again. So there are some definite shortcomings, and I'll leave the rest of my comments to maybe questions and answers. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, I'll add in my thanks to Margaret for organizing and to the Dickey Center in Dartmouth for for hosting us today. It's a pleasure to be here. And before I start, I also just want to applaud. Thanks. I also want to applaud and commend Blaise on this remarkable work. I think we often tell our students to separate quality and quantity, and when I got Blaise's PDF and finished reading it, I was both full of admiration, but thought it a great example of just a fine piece of work and an extensive research, and really so inspiring to read the work of students like you and future scholars who are so engaged with their materials and conduct such fine research. So I'm actually going to take up some of the questions that Blaise raised about memorialization and discuss more, focus my discussion on the last chapters of his project. Blaise's research project points to the ways in which post-war narrativization has contributed to a collective identity and a historical lens on the past that reinforces ethnic divisions created during and, as we've heard here, before the Balkan Wars. Such narratives do little, as we see in Blaise's project, to encourage acknowledgement, accountability, or redress among or between communities who have perpetrated acts of violence against one another. In other words, the memory of mass violence has led to the establishment of narratives. Blaise writes specifically of museums and other memorialization processes that reinforce an identity of victimization. But in so doing, these narratives deny space for the possibility of the victimization of other communities, and they also fail to acknowledge acts of violence or atrocity perpetrated by members of the community they claim to represent. There's a lot to be said about the tension between creativity and production on the one hand, and violence and destruction on the other, and I'm thinking here both of bodies, individuals, and texts, and Blaise's discussion speaks to this set of interactions in important ways that I hope we'll have time to explore in our discussion. But as a non-Balkan specialist, in my introductory comments here, I'm just going to focus my observations on some of the larger questions about identity and conflict transformation that crop up in Blaise's work, and in particular the ways in which these strands might be reconceived to address or to begin to address the lacuna, the shortcomings in the post-war reconciliation processes that Blaise discusses so thoroughly. I'll also mention briefly at the end of my comments 2 projects that are going on in the region that speak to the need to challenge the nationalist myths and memories that Blaise examines. And what I find compelling about these projects is their recognition not only of the need to critically address narratives about the past, but to think about the history and memory of violence as a narrative that needs to be included in reconciliation processes, and in so doing kind of responds to the way in which history has been co-opted by nationalist or for nationalist purposes. And I think in this sense they speak to really a core component of Blaise's discussion and argument. So there are 2 conceptual components to Blaise's research that I'd like to focus on. First are the historical considerations of the project, and the conclusion that essentially over-nationalized histories lead to unresolved historical legacies, which themselves constitute a major obstacle to reconciliation efforts. And to my mind, one of the shortcomings of conflict transformation studies as a field, and really in practice as well, is the fact that too often history and a kind of approach to the past is seen as something that should be set aside as a precondition to creating a better future. Now, that's not to say that the importance of the past is denied. In fact, if anything, we can think of it as the opposite. History is treated gingerly or even fearfully because of a kind of recognition of its ability to stir the flames of a divisive discourse that might reignite tensions. But the response is that conflicting narratives about the past, the way that past events are remembered by different groups, the ways in which communities in conflict have interpreted and taught a certain history to their members, are held at arm's length from the central components in reconciliation processes. And I'll quote one scholar in this field, Barbara Tint, who writes, "We're still operating with limited ability to infuse our present interventions with appropriate and relevant connections to how conflict parties have internalized their lived or learned history." History and the way it is remembered, in other words, are not integrated components within mainstream conflict resolution or conflict transformation discourses, because history is often seen as a liability, even if its importance is acknowledged. And Blaze's project reminds us not only of the importance of history, but also how critical it is to post-conflict discourse. Blaze both frames his discussion within the broader historical picture of the 20th century, but also notes, particularly with regard to the Balkan Wars, that distinct and essentialized narratives have been constructed for the conduct of each ethnic group, with the result that nationalistic myths of valor and victimhood are the norm rather than the exception in collective memory processes. The question of how to challenge such myths, I think, is something that you can take up in your next project, please, and is something I'll return to in a moment, but very important to think of history as something that can't be ignored or set aside in post-conflict settings. Second, the other component I just wanted to comment briefly on is Blaze's very thought-provoking exploration of memory and collective identity. Hannah Arendt once wrote of the need to set aside not the memory, but the continuing hostility and the need for retribution associated with the memory of the painful past. There are different processes that aim to take up this challenge: transitional justice processes, which we heard about with Tanya's presentation, the sort of primary focus being judicial inquiries and testimony, have a tendency to focus on the individual, and this, of course, is a fundamental component of reconciliation processes. Victim testimony, trials against perpetrators are all critical to that work. But that's only one part of the conflict transformation landscape. The field of historical dialogue, unlike transitional justice, really focuses its emphasis on the collective memory of conflict, on long-term transformation efforts, on acknowledging this role of history in understanding conflict, and on exploring restorative action at the group level. We can think of public history projects, maybe museums, memorials, questions of reparation and redress at the group level as well as being part of that. And I think one thing that interested me in Blaze's research is the way in which he speaks to both of these components of reconciliation processes. The goal of these projects in a sort of collective that aim toward a more group focus is to address precisely what reconciliation around the individual doesn't, namely identifying and engaging opposing sides in a critical understanding of the past, enabling all sides of a conflict to recognize more nuanced or multi-perspectival understandings of the past that, while of course open to disagreement and different interpretations, really seek to ensure that these disagreements don't escalate the conflict once again in prescribed terms where opinions are divided along identity lines. And this is something, unfortunately, that we see far too often. So these shared narratives contribute to conflict transformation by fostering understanding for alternative perspectives and facilitating the construction of a new perception of the past. And so what I'm suggesting here, and I think what is so interesting in Blaze's work, is really this idea that perceptions about the past can change, and a change in the approach and understanding of the past is a necessary component to the process of conflict transformation. And Blaze's discussion of the politicization of memory in the Balkans really speaks to this need to identify, to contest, to dismantle nationalist myths and identities as part of the broader context of reconciliation or conflict transformation processes, both on the individual level but also on the collective or group level. There are different examples of what form such engagement might take, and of course none of these possibilities are easy, but they all serve as vital contributions to the possibility of creating opportunities for former adversaries to reconsider their relationship with the other. Certainly this is done through the acknowledgement of responsibility and guilt for a crime and through recognizing individual victims of past violence, but also through challenging instances of denial and through challenging national or ethnic memories of heroism or victimhood, promoting efforts at understanding the past that counter assumptions that opposing sides of a conflict have to view conflict as a kind of zero-sum rivalry. One such process that I mentioned earlier is this idea of creating a shared narrative about the past, the goal being to enable greater understanding, but also to encourage contact between groups or communities who have a history of violence. As you probably guess, this isn't a typical history project or necessarily the work of scholars in the sense that I suppose when we think of a typical historical production, much like what Blaise has written, we have a single person who researches, sets forth an argument, and then provides space where readers can agree or object or laud or criticize. Shared narratives really use the discourse of history as part of a larger process of reconciliation. Typically, the personal background of the scholars involved will represent the groups in conflict, although not necessarily and often not with institutional or governmental authorization. And the idea is not to reach consensus on every issue, but to consider disagreements from a critical perspective rather than from an identity perspective. In other words, shared narratives conceive of history as a tool that can lend to a better understanding of a spectrum of positions and allow for the deconstruction of the myths that Blaise has talked about in the context of Croatia specifically. I think Blaise's discussion here today and his thesis project really points to the need for more such critical analysis to take place in the context of the Balkans, where a critical approach to history continues to be a very controversial and difficult undertaking. And in fact, there are very few examples that at least I could find or that I know about of shared narratives or historical dialogue projects in the Balkan context. But I'll conclude my remarks by naming two interesting examples, both of which take up to some degree the issue of Croatia specifically. One of these projects is more scholarly. It's an actual a shared narrative project that was published under the auspices of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in 2011 by a Croatian and Bosnian scholar, but also with the participation of Serbian scholars as well. It was published by Vyacheslav Perica and Darko Gavrilovic, and it really draws on scholars from all parts of the Balkans and aims to both examine but also comment on, analyze destructive political myths within the societies of the former Yugoslavia, and to think about the ways in which these myths have been used to construct a particular history that speaks to ideology, that speaks to identity politics. As an examination of narratives that form the past, the analysis is striking, but the discursive and critical process of examination, the inclusion and engagement in this project of individuals from different communities is also, I think, key to its success, and it points to I think an unusual use of history, one that maybe scholars are not always comfortable with, but this idea of history itself as a form of advocacy, as a kind of central component to post-conflict transformation processes. And the other example I'll just mention briefly actually again speaks to the idea of history as a form of advocacy, because it's not in the scholarly world, it's in the world of advocacy and practitioners. And in fact, I think that's one of the interesting things about researching and thinking about history in post-conflict contexts, is that there is this sort of straddling between different kinds of communities. But the Youth Initiative for Human Rights, which is a Balkan, has seats in different countries in the Balkans, but their base in Croatia has actually initiated a terrific project that I think speaks to many of the themes Blaise raises, and it's a project that is meant to encourage high school students to look at the official narratives of their textbooks, to bring students together from different countries in the Balkans, and to give them the tools to actually write their own shared narrative, but also to question and to analyze critically the narratives that have been produced and are sort of officially recognized by their different governments, with the idea of, even if it's not producing a kind of scholarly version of shared narrative, of teaching a younger generation how to look at their own past more critically, and to think even about questions of collective identity, conflicting narratives about the past, in different ways from those that have been passed down. So there are a number of interesting shared narrative and historical dialogue projects, I think, that are happening in the region. The question of their success and how communities and individuals respond to them really remains to be seen in large part, but the question of how to make history and questions of identity a constructive, critical component of the post-conflict reconciliation process, and this is a need that Blaise's research makes abundantly clear, is also the incentive behind this kind of work, which in and of itself, I think, marks an important contribution and moment. So I'll end there, and we can continue the conversation, I hope.
Thank you. We're now will open the floor to questions, comments from you to any of you. And I think we need to speak into the microphone.
Here. Here's the microphone. Oh, okay.
So do we have questions, comments?
You did mention the moving from winner's justice to international justice. Can you speak more about that? Yeah.
Well, Nuremberg was set up, as people may or may not know, it was set up by the Allies, and it was under the direction of the United States, and it's referred to as victor's justice because they indicted the top leadership of the Third Reich. They tried them, and they executed them, in essence. It was run by principally the United States. So it was pretty much straightforward, and there were, there was a continuing effort, though, after the top leadership was tried, and most of them were executed. Then the trials continued under what was called a Article 10 proceedings, and that had a short life, and it addressed what the conscience of the world felt at the time was appropriate. But when you get to 1993, the EU has a belief that they don't embrace capital punishment, one. Two, international jurisprudence may not have progressed during those years. However, courts across the EU, there's an EU Court of Human Rights, had been established, And there were juridical processes that is pretty much in line with most Western democracies, with some differences. So Victor's justice, that was decidedly not to use that approach with respect to the International War Crimes Tribunal for Yugoslavia. And the sentencing was a combination of based upon local sentencing of former Yugoslavia and European standards. So Blaise spoke to the recent acquittal of Vojislav Šešelj, who's a rather repugnant figure from Belgrade, who was found to be guilty of participating in a joint criminal enterprise in a previous case. So many people, and Croatia was very disturbed by the acquittal and condemned it, as did people in Bosnia and Herzegovina. What he did was he ran the irregular militia under his leadership. These persons would engage in, they were not official members of the army. They would invade villages, they would plunder, they would rape, they would then blow the roofs off the houses, they would ethnically clean the village so that people could no longer live there and they would leave. So this person has been found guilty of engaging in a joint criminal enterprise, but in this case, in the most recent case, he was acquitted of all charges, and people are shocked, absolutely shocked. He is now in Belgrade because he's been there for some time to get treatment for cancer. And he basically said when they were the days leading up to the pronouncement on his sentence, he said, I just refuse and I may not even return to The Hague. But now there's a debate going on that because he's already been found guilty, he may be returned to The Hague, but it's a political problem. So all of these issues now are dealt with in a more contemporary context, but they're also sort of problematic as well. And so it's not Victor's justice. And preceding the Šešelj sentencing was the conviction of Radovan Karadzic, and he was found guilty of 10 of the 11 charges, including one charge of genocide, and he was sentenced to 40 years. And that happened just a few days before Šešelj. So that's an example of, yes, someone convicted of genocide may get 40 years. If it was Victor's justice, they would have hung him. So that's an example of the difference. Questions, comments?
I was reflecting on your comments and also your Dr. Domi's comments about really the informal history, the intergenerational history that both contributed to and now is potentially leading up to the war and now since the war, the memory of the war. So in order to move towards reconciliation, how do you develop a shared narrative that's based on fact, that it has some of that emotion that comes with the informal history, to come to an opportunity to have a shared understanding of what happened and a shared acceptance, really, of what happened?
Good question. You go first. I have some comments, but absolutely
Memory
expert.
It's a tough question, and I think it's one of those things that's in some ways a learning by doing process. So the second project that I mentioned, that Youth Initiative for Human Rights process, the approach they're taking is first to expose young people, and I do think it's important, often to engage young people in this process, so people who are more open to new ideas, to, don't have a kind of, as hardened a vision of the past. And this is a project that's ongoing, by the way, but the stage that they've already completed is to a kind of documentation process where they introduce students to documentation either from the ICTY, from witness and survivor testimonies, from different resources available to them, to really begin the process of teaching students how to engage critically with texts and with narrative, and to be able to ask questions about the kinds of narratives that have really been handed down and that have been a formulaic part of their education. The stage that they're at now is to bring their textbooks from the 5 participating countries together and to discuss and really examine a kind of comparative approach to look at what's in these different textbooks, which I think will be very interesting for them to do. And then to create mixed groups of different students from different countries together to work on shared narratives, and then to, I think they're sort of taking that scholarly component and joining it with trips to either sites of mass atrocities, memorial sites. I think they'll be going to, possibly going to the ICTY, I'm not sure. But, you know, a kind of combination of efforts. Now that's a very different kind of project from a more scholarly approach of someone like Darko Gavrilovic, who has the tools, and there it's about engaging, you know, it's really about finding people who are willing to engage in a kind of critical analysis, which can be very hard to find. I think the starting point there is to really find like-minded people who are willing to do that kind of exercise on, who come from different backgrounds. So you don't start with the nationalist sort of politician on the right.
And
Yeah.
I would
Oh.
just add into that, speaking specifically about textbooks, I know there's an NGO in Croatia called Documenta, which a few years ago tried to do, and got funding from the government to do a textbook supplement to sort of bring it past 1985, 87-ish. And they came out with a textbook supplement that actually went into the details of Operation Storm and mentioned the ethnic cleansing that occurred as part of it. And the government refused to allow it to be printed and pulled their funding. But then going off of what you were saying earlier on the courts, I think that one of the big functions of the ICTY is to sort of create that official history, and you can debate whether or not that's good or bad or neutral. But, and one of the big things that I looked at in my thesis was the conviction and then acquittal or appeal of Ante Gotovina. And when he was first convicted, it was sort of a shock sent through Croatia, because he's all over the place. Actually, on the last slide that I showed, that was his image opposite Tudjman on the mural. And he's, you know, on posters everywhere, and he's still a very, very popular figure, and was at the time. So when he was convicted for his role in Operation Storm, and it served to challenge that national narrative. However, when he was acquitted on appeal, it allowed that national narrative to flourish again, because now the court was saying that nothing bad happened during Operation Storm and that everything was fine. And one of my favorite images from post-war Croatia is he actually gets off the plane in Zagreb with a white dove and just lets it into the air as he steps off the plane, and then marches through the streets carrying the flag.
Yeah, and I think this is the regrettable role of the court, in my view, because we know that crimes were committed, and you know, these are international judges, and everybody goes, why did that happen? And so there's a big debate among the international human rights community about the legacy of this court. But let me also add, there's another initiative underway which includes a lot of human rights lawyers and people that could be more closely aligned with official parts of governments or not, depending. And it's called the Raycom Initiative, which is sponsored by the Humanitarian Law Center out of Belgrade, where they asked community human rights people to come together from all the countries and to agree to what you would call a truth and reconciliation process, but they don't use that term because people don't react negatively to that term. But that has been underway, and actually I'm surprised at how far it's advanced, because there's still, as Blaise has pointed out, there's really, very, very firm beliefs about history and what happened and what didn't happen. There is a belief that, the Serbs are victims of the court, but when we look at the number of crimes that were committed, just look at the number of concentration camps that were run by Serbs. Vast majority of the crimes were committed by Serbs. There were some crimes committed by Croats and some by Bosniaks, but the vast majority are Serbs. So the idea that the head of state and the prime minister of Serbia will not acknowledge that genocide legally was determined, happened in Srebrenica, they refuse to recognize that. They refuse to this day that this inability to face the past. And so I think the kinds of activities you're talking about with young people is where really it probably has to begin. Now, let's not discount, however, that we are looking at many students in these schools are in ethnically segregated schools. And the president of Croatia actually said it's a good thing because they're not killing each other. She said this at Columbia University when she spoke at the World Leaders Forum in the fall. She extolled the fact that she could walk down the street in Mostar and the people were okay and they were nice to her. So this gives you the kind of idea and justified the ethnic segregation in Eastern Slavonia, etc. So young people now are growing up where they don't know, as a Croat, they don't know a Serb person in their classroom in 5th grade or 6th grade, or they don't know a Bosniak in Mostar because they're in segregated Croat schools. They call it 2 schools under one roof, where Croat children go to school in the morning and the Bosniaks go in the afternoon. Now this is really regrettable. And when the United States was really engaged, they told the governments, if this happens, if you segregate your classrooms, we will pull every dime out. And they didn't, but then the United States after 9/11 really withdrew, as an example.
And I mean, you don't just see this with the recent war, you also see it with World War II, looking at the numbers killed in Jasenovac, which is the largest death camp in former Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
Some Serb nationalists go up to 1 million. People were killed, just Serbs were killed there.
Yeah.
And then Franjo Tudjman, who was a historian before he became president, ballparked the number at like 15,000 in that range. And I think the communist government, which I think they ballparked it at a couple 100,000. I don't know the stat off the top of my head, but it was a couple 100,000. And sadly, that's the most reliable stat, probably.
Right.
I think we are out of time. Thank you very much.